Marvel Comics has a deep, dark secret that they wish they could forget. In fact, they actually went back and erased this character from existence. Long before the Black Panther graced the comic books in 1966, Marvel had another black hero before this. But why would Marvel claim Black Panther is the first if they had another black hero before? This is a story of Marvel's bizarre and very controversial first black hero, Whitewash Jones. The history of African Americans in comics isn't a pretty one, but this wasn't unique just to comics during the time. In the early years, if any black character showed up, they were mostly used as gags or butt of the joke. Here is an early example of Wiz Comics with Captain Marvel, in which he had a sidekick named Steamboat in 1942. But Marvel's character, Whitewash Jones, would appear 1 year earlier in the summer of 1941. In the beginning years of comics, they found that kids were primarily their target audience. With that, the publishers started to make their adult heroes have kid sidekicks, so that their audience would have something to relate with. Even though later they realized that kids didn't identify with sidekicks and really identified with the heroes instead, starting with Robin in 1940, who was the very first sidekick, they saw their numbers grow. Wiz Comics did something different by having their adult superhero also turn into a kid, with Billy Batson becoming Captain Marvel. Soon after, Captain Marvel started to become the #1 selling superhero comic, even outselling Superman. As the publishers saw this, they began pushing kid sidekicks onto almost all their adult superheroes. Captain America first appeared in December of 1940, and even in the beginning with his first issue, he had a sidekick, Bucky Barnes, who was supposed to be about 12 years old at the time. Human Torch got Toro, Black Terror got Tim, Blue Beetle had Sparky, Mr. Scarlet got Pink the Whiz Kid, and the list goes on and on. In the summer of 1941, Timely Comics, which is now known as Marvel Comics, decided to do something bold. They started a new comic book title called Young Allies, where it was not only Marvel's first ever team, but it would also be a team of just sidekicks. It starred Bucky and Toro and their sidekicks. Yes, the sidekicks had sidekicks. Every member of the team was something of a joke. The fat kid, the smart kid, the tough kid, and the black kid, Whitewash Jones. Most of the jokes were at the expense of the sidekicks, with many of the jokes for Whitewash Jones dealing with his speech and mannerisms. Shortly after, another black hero joined called Slow Motion Jones in USA Comics #6 in December of 1942. While most of the time they were just there to get captured while the main superheroes could save them, they did have their moments to shine as well. Whitewash would fight alongside with his costume heroes, but mostly preferred to let the costume heroes do most of the work. As the war ended, comic publishers found it hard to have a villain for their heroes to fight, as most comics during the early to mid-1940s were geared towards their heroes fighting enemies of the United States. Shortly after the war, many comic titles started being canceled due to dwindling sales. The Young Allies was canceled by issue number 20 in October 1946. That was the last time Whitewash Jones appeared. As the 1950s approached, most superhero titles and comic publishers were canceled. Readers moved on to horror, romance, westerns, and sci-fi comics. It wasn't until Showcase number 4 when superheroes began their resurgence, which moved comics from the Golden Age to the Silver Age. In 2009, Marvel came out with a new Young Allies comic for their 70th anniversary. It was a one-shot special that featured most of the crew from the 1940s team. This is where Marvel went back and rewrote its history. Rewriting history wasn't anything new, as it had been done many times before with other characters in comics. In the new Young Allies comic book, it had been revealed that a lot of Allies' wartime adventures were made into comic books as propaganda for the United States to earn support for the war effort, especially among young, impressionable people. The comic books that they made for propaganda, while based on true events, were oftentimes embellished and sensationalized. Further, to protect the identities of the Young Allies, they were all portrayed as caricatures of themselves, and were all portrayed as being young adolescents around the age of 12, while in real life, they were in their late teens to early adulthood, and eventually became old enough to enlist in the military and see action on the battlefield. Washington Carver Jones was renamed to Whitewash Jones for these propaganda comic books. But according to the Young Allies special, Washington Jones actually enlisted in the military, where he fought alongside Captain America and Bucky. By the time he retired from service, he had earned the rank of colonel. He lived out his lives and died many years later. Bucky and Captain America would attend his funeral. The whole thing's kind of confusing. So, the 1940s comic books that actually doesn't exist in real life, they made another comic book in 2009 that also exists here, but saying that those comic books that existed, even though they were real for its time, were actually just propaganda for their universe. Make sense? Kind of, yeah. Many people will look back at this time and might be disgusted, and this is why Marvel Comics tried to distance themselves from this and rewrite their history to say it was all fictional propaganda. To me, I look at it differently. I see Whitewash Jones as a stepping stone that needed to happen to get to where we are today. Because of Marvel Comics taking that first step and putting Whitewash Jones in as one of the main characters of the first ever Marvel team, from that would come more characters and more publishers taking chances after seeing the success Marvel had. A few years later, in 1947, we would see the first ever all African American comic book called All Negro Comics #1, which featured the superhero Lion Man, among others. This was notable for multiple reasons, as not only being the first comic solely featuring black heroes, but also being the first comic book written and drawn solely by an African American. But sadly, there would only be one issue, as the creator couldn't get enough money to produce the second issue. Then in 1954, Waku, Prince of Bantu, would feature in Jungle Tales from Atlas Comics, which was the name Marvel Comics went by during the 1950s. This was the first time a black character would ever be the lead feature in a comic. It was a far departure from how black characters were portrayed, as Waku was not comedic or helpless. He was a strong, intelligent leader. Black heroes would not be featured again for almost 10 years. In 1965, the Western hero Lobo would get 2 issues from Dell Comics. Lobo is the first African American hero to have his own title. This was a major moment in comic book history, but it would end suddenly as the publisher Dell Comics would discover that most bundles of comics would be returned unopened as retailers refused to support a black hero, forcing the book to be canceled with the second issue. A few years later, we got Marvel's Black Panther in 1966 Fantastic Four number 52. A lot of people always say he's the first African-American superhero, but he's not American. He's a king of an African nation. The Black Panther would be the first black character to have, quote, superpowers, although that is not true. He didn't have any innate superpowers. He just had his tech, similar to Batman or Iron Man. He would eat an herb that heightened his senses, but that's about it. Black Panther would start the rise of black heroes as comic readers were willing to accept black heroes as supporting characters. It would be 4 years before the first African-American superhero would debut in the character Falcon in Captain America 117 in 1969. In 1973, we saw Nubia, the first black female superhero from DC Comics in Wonder Woman number 204. Luke Cage debuted in 1974 with his own comic, who is the first African-American superhero to have his own comic series. More and more black characters started popping up in comics. Even in 1993, a group of black artists and writers started their own publishing company, Milestone Comics, where they came out with many different black heroes. Most notable is Static Shock. In the summer of 1997, Spawn would make its theatrical debut, becoming the first film to feature an African-American superhero in a starring role. So I hope you learned a little bit about comic book history. I'm Dave from Comic Book Investments. Have a great day.